Hello and welcome to episode 3 of A Musical Soliloquy. My name is Steven and I'm here with Zach. And as you can see, we have a very special episode because we are actually in person in my home in Chicago. Zach actually drove 6 hours from Cleveland to record this episode, so it's a really special one. Today, we'll be talking about the role of interpretation in music.
Yes, and specifically we'll be focusing on imagination and what an important role that can play in the interpretive process. I notice that often the score is viewed as where music is originally conceived. But although the score is a very helpful roadmap, I believe the music actually begins before the notes are written down, and the thoughts, the emotions, and imagination of the composer. And I think that's really important to keep in mind through the interpretive process. Music, like all art, exists to express ideas and emotion. That's why I think the personal connection that we form with music matters so deeply. So we're excited to dive into that. With no further ado, what we'll like to do with this episode, we'll touch on various composers and we'll discuss how we approach interpretation. First on the list, we have Debussy, and specifically Debussy's Violin Sonata.
Yeah, so Zach talked about the role of interpretation and how music is actually not so much notes, but thoughts first. And I think that's wonderful. Going into Debussy Sonata, this is obviously a very French impressionistic work. I love this piece because all three movements are continuous and they represent slightly different characters, but it kind of is cohesive. I am actually not as imaginative in terms of strict images or movies compared to Zach, but I always think more about just the natural emotion that I want to convey. In the opening of that sonata, I think of something that is a little bit far away, and I want to express something that is quite deep, but also not too complex yet. The second theme of that sonata, when it's on the G string and it's the impressionistic part, you can think of like an impressionistic painting, for example, and just the beauty of all of the colors. It's clear yet not at the same time. Those are my first few thoughts. What did you have for Debussy?
I actually have a similar impression in terms of, well, I also draw inspiration from painting. I think some interesting background on the sonata is that since it was Debussy's last piece composed ever, Debussy said that it would be interesting for the world to see the work of a sick, dying man in a time of war. And he was like, I only wrote this piece spurred on by my publisher. Basically, he was pretty down about the piece. He didn't think that it was that great, which to me is crazy because I think it's such an incredible piece. And in just 15 minutes, he packs in quite a punch. There's so many emotional highs and lows. And I really feel like it's a fitting piece to come as his final testament.
I think he wrote this piece in a set of other sonatas. He wrote a cello and a flute sonata. So there's that too, but we're a little biased. We like the violin one.
Yeah, I love the violin one. I love the cello sonata. And to be honest, I haven't listened to the flute. I should, but yeah. I think this piece is so incredible. And actually, the first time I ever heard the sonata was when Steven performed it. And it was so emotionally impactful. I remember Steven started and his sound was so warm. But I remember that distant feeling. It's warm yet cold at the same time. It almost reminded me of when you're in a room with the fireplace, but you're a little bit farther away and you can feel that it's warm, but you're still cold. That's the feeling that I got when you started.
Wow, that's a really good analogy. I think that's wonderful. I didn't know that he wrote the piece at a time of war, you mentioned?
Yeah, World War I believe, was going on during that time. He was actually dying of cancer, so he wasn't really feeling very good. And actually, our teacher, Mr. Sloman, talked to me about the segmented nature of this piece, where it changes characters so quickly, almost without transition. Sloman theorized perhaps Debussy, because he wasn't feeling so well, he would write a little bit, and then he'd go do something else, and he would come back, and he would write a little bit. And that was just Sloman's theory, and who knows, but that makes sense to me. And really what always comes to mind, and I know that Picasso was not a French painter, but very interestingly, there is a painting in the Cleveland Art Museum called La Vie, which means the life. And it's a blue period painting, which Picasso actually, during that period of his life, one of his close friends died and he was very depressed. And he uses the color blue to express that. And it's a unique color of blue, actually. When I played the sonata, that painting just kept coming to mind. And for some reason, Impressionist paintings don't seem to match the color that I want to express.
Oh, really?
And so this Picasso painting, and I think that how interesting, I didn't know at that time about the history of the painting, and I didn't really know about Picasso's blue period, but the image of that painting kept haunting my thoughts, basically. And so when I learned more about it, and I learned that he was also reflecting on death, and Debussy, when Debussy wrote the piece, was reflecting on death, I thought those really worked well together, actually, even though they were from different periods and styles.
Yeah, that is a really good analogy too. And you mentioned Picasso isn't directly impressionist, but
No,
there
since
are
he's a
yeah,
Spanish.
but there are elements of that blue color and that you could relate it. I don't think it has to be impressionist if it's French necessarily. So,
Yeah, I mean, Picasso was very innovative with this style, and I think the whole Impressionist movement, they were innovating on what had already come before. And I think that I really identify with the Impressionist and Post-Impressionist movements because art had become so standardized. Everybody had perfected technique, but what they found was that people were starting to paint things very much alike. Technique was so precise that things started to look very much the same. So Impressionists, they had fantastic technique, but they wanted to do something different. They wanted to express the fleeting moment. They wanted to express a feeling that you get from one specific moment. And they really used light to reflect their feelings. And I think that was very interesting, at least to me, because that's exactly what I hope to do with music. I think that technique is very important. And of course, none of the Impressionists had poor technique, but because they chose, rather than to spell out every detail to give impressions, they were actually heavily critiqued at that time.
yeah, talking about painting and using the brush and maybe being not so perfect with the stroke to create the impressionist painting, we have that same thing in violin playing when we're playing these French pieces, because often we're told to float the bow a little bit more. And while you can be quite precise with that, it is a little bit more to the imagination. And I think that's something that you must be really intrigued in. When you play something in a not so matter of fact way and you do it with a little bit interesting bow pressure and bow speed, it creates and conveys a sort of image that is not so maybe direct and obvious.
I totally agree. And one thing that I think is so interesting, at least to me, is when I'm playing this sonata specifically, I always imagine my bow as a paintbrush. And I just think that this sonata, other pieces, of course, like Rachmaninoff, always strikes me as a musical painting as well, because he has so many colors and it feels so vivid. This piece, I think the first movement is very blue, and then the second movement, I think, is tinged with more red, and the last movement goes back to blue before it goes to some other colors, I think. It's a
Yeah.
very colorful sonata, and I think that viewing music as a painting too, at least for me, sound is so nebulous. It affects me, but when I'm trying to interpret things, I find that connecting to other visual mediums helps me interpret a lot, whether that's art or film. That really helps me a lot. And I think about the textures that you have in paintings. A lot of the time, some paintings, you can't see the brush strokes at all. And then in other paintings, they make a point to show their brush strokes, just like how we might sometimes hide our bow changes and make our phrases really legato. You can't see any of our brush strokes. And then sometimes you really want to accentuate the brush strokes and show exactly the texture of the paint that you're using.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's great that you talked about the connection of music and art, visual art. And I just thought of Sayaka Shoji again
Hmm.
because there's this video of her when she was learning the Bartók solo sonata. And she was talking about how she was drawing inspiration from painting, and that
Wow.
as violinists, we actually can literally feel like we're painting because we have hair and we have a surface that creates sound. And I personally do think about painting, but I could definitely go more in that direction. So I think it's great that you're talking about all these things because ultimately what we're trying to express is an emotion and a feeling. And we're not trying to express that we're playing certain notes or that we're able to do this stroke perfectly.
It's true. I think that one thing that comes to mind when you talk about painting and the texture of painting too is Rothko's color fields. And those are very interesting to me. When we were at Colburn, actually, right next door, there was the Museum of Contemporary Art, LACMA, I think they called it. And they actually had quite a few Rothkos. And when I first went to go, I thought, well, these are boring paintings. I didn't get it at all because it's just these squares of color floating on color. And I thought, I don't know about this. This doesn't seem like this takes much skill. But for some reason, it kind of stuck with me. And I kept thinking about them. And through the years, I've come to appreciate them more and more. And interestingly enough, Rothko actually mentioned that his paintings are purely emotional experiences. He's trying to create an emotional experience when you look at the painting. And I feel that as I've looked at them more and more, I've connected to that. He really labored over these blocks of color and he applied all different textures, including egg yolk and different multi-medium type stuff. And he labored for hours just to get the right feeling that he was looking for. So I think that's really
Wow.
inspiring. Yeah.
That is similar to what we do to find the right colors in our performances, for sure. I remember the Rothko paintings as well. We had an art teacher who would take us right down the street to the art galleries. And I remember her talking about how the lighting in the art galleries, how they display the artwork, plays a big factor into how the art is perceived. And I guess that could be related to playing in a concert hall and the hall that we play in. And that also plays a factor into it too.
I think you're totally right. Yeah, Mark Rothko, actually, one of Kennedy's relatives, they wanted to commission a Rothko, and he went to their home and he looked around and he said, "There's no good place." So he refused. So I think that's pretty cool. Well, let's move on to the next musical artist, Franck, Caesar Franck. Maybe let's talk about his sonata. Why don't you start with your interpretation, Stephen?
Yeah. So famously, he wrote this as a wedding gift. I actually draw inspiration from Zach's interpretation of this piece
Oh,
because,
thanks, Stephen.
and he'll share it in more detail, but I think there really is a progression from the first to second to third to fourth movements. The first movement is kind of calm and serene and is like an introduction, a prelude, sort of sets the scene type. And the second movement is very fiery, and it's where you experience all the tremendous highs and even turmoil and agony at moments, but also blissful moments too. And then the third movement is completely slow, and you're able to take a break from all that fire, and it's more introspective. And so I really try to bring out that character. What's cool about the third movement is it has themes that the fourth movement uses, and it foreshadows a little bit. And then the fourth movement is back in major, and it is just one of the most beautiful and catching melodies. And you just feel that you've gone through this entire journey from beginning to end. When you arrive to the fourth movement, it just feels satisfying because you had gone through the first three movements. And if you play it alone, it wouldn't have that same effect. It ends in a flurry. And yeah, in terms of more specific things that come to mind, Franck is impressionistic as well, but he is a little bit more kind of in that romantic context, a little bit more real in some ways. So I think there's aspects of, like Tchaikovsky or Brahms that I would apply more in Franck than Debussy. Generally, when I'm playing romantic works, I think passion is very important. and having fire, as compared to classical works, which we'll talk about. In the Romantic period, it just expanded on classical, and it felt like you could more directly express this intense fire as compared to classical and Baroque styles. And I think that's what really characterizes Romantic works. And Franck Sonata is extremely romantic. So that is kind of general, but I would say my approach to it is definitely going to be a lot of intense vibrato, a little bit more into the string for sure, and really long, sustained, connected phrases.
Mm.
And obviously, tons of juicy harmonies in Franck. So,
Yeah.
really bringing out those harmony changes and reacting to them in the moment, they're so special. If you can really bring a different color when the harmony changes, it just is so special. There's so many of those moments in Franck. So it's a piece that I certainly love. Why don't you share your famous story about it?
Okay. Well, I love Franck Sonata, and actually, when I was young, I thought it was basically the perfect piece because I felt that it spanned so much emotion. And I thought that if you needed to pick one piece for the rest of your life, it would suit that need because you had basically every emotion that you needed to express encapsulated in one piece.
You do.
And
Yeah.
like you said, it was written for a wedding present for one of our favorite violinists, Eugene Yazai. And he premiered it at his wedding with the pianist there, as is well known. And apparently, some of the wedding guests thought that they weren't together because of the canon in the last movement. So that was kind of funny. But I mean, what a beautiful wedding gift. And it's incredible that they were able to just throw it together like that, too, because that's a hard piece.
Yeah, people forget about how great these great artists were back then. I mean, they didn't practice for months to play something. They just played anything. They could sight read really hard pieces. I'm not
Yeah.
saying people can't today, but it's less common. Nowadays, everyone works really hard to perfect it and then go on stage. But
Yeah, I'm
yeah.
definitely not a good sight reader. If I got a piece like Franck Sonata for my wedding, I would say, okay, well, maybe I can perform it next year. So the story that I have for Franck Sonata is that the four movements are basically the four stages of love. And the first movement represents the first stage of love when you just meet somebody and you feel like there are connections, but you walk past each other and you notice each other and you're afraid to say too much or too little, and you're both very careful about the way that you interact, but there's something there. There's definitely something there, and you feel that. And I think that movement, it always feels like it's going somewhere and then it goes away. It's the same type of yearning that I associate with Fauré's Violin Sonata, actually. But Fauré's Violin Sonata, I think, is even wavier, I guess I would say.
Yes.
Franck Sonata is very much contained within the self, I would say. The first movement is that first stage of love. The second movement, the relationship has moved along and you've encountered some issues. And I think the second movement for me is the anger and frustration that can sometimes come out when you have miscommunications or, you know, things just happen in relationships. They're not always easy. And so it's pretty stormy. And there are those moments of agony and misery, as you mentioned, and there's a lot of intensity there. The third movement for me is sadness and despair. I think that that can happen a lot of the time in relationships, and that's just part of being in a relationship. No matter how great your relationship is, there are those moments where you will feel sadness and despair. And it's very introspective. And there are those moments where you feel so much internal tension, especially near the end of the piece, where it's the ya ya dum. Sorry that people have to listen to my singing. But there's so much internal tension, and it's not that loud really, but you feel so much tension inside. And just to go off on a random tangent here, to go back to painting, I think one of the artists that I really like, even though he wasn't a very good human being, is Jackson Pollock. And what I like about a lot of his paintings is he was nicknamed Jack the Dripper by Time magazine because of his techniques. And one of his techniques was he would take paint in his hand and he would fling it across the canvas. And this adds an energy to his art that I find very compelling. And I feel the same when you're trying to express something musically. If you use a lot of energy in your bow, it comes through in the sound, versus if you just start with no energy and you just go, it comes across completely differently. If you want energy, then you infuse the sound with energy using your bow speed and actually putting energy into the sound. I think the same in this moment when you're trying to build a state of tension. If you're very relaxed during the section, the sound isn't going to sound tense. So actually, even though tension is usually frowned on, generally speaking,
Yes.
it's actually a good thing to be tense when you're trying to portray a tense emotion. It adds something to the sound. I don't know why it does, but it does.
It certainly does. Yeah, that inner feeling we often talk about as violinists not being tense, but the music is certainly tense at many moments. And I definitely agree. That's certainly one moment.
Yeah, it's like you have to feel it in your stomach and the knots there, and it's just so hard to get a sound out and to struggle a little bit getting that sound there. I love that moment because in the third movement, it feels agonizing. And that theme actually comes back in the fourth movement, but there it feels much more triumphant and open. And Heifetz plays that in octaves actually in the fourth movement, which is really impressive.
Yeah, in the third movement, it is very inward, like you said. And then in the fourth movement, it's like an outburst.
Yeah, it just feels like you're expressing everything you want to express. The fourth movement, in my opinion, is the true joy of love. It's blissful, it's serene, it's everything you hoped love would be in the first movement. And that true joy in love happens in every relationship. There are those moments as well. And that's what I think is the epitome of a successful relationship. Hopefully, that you have a lot of those moments that are filled with joy and genuine happiness.
Yeah.
And the theme is just so beautiful. It's this perfect duet between the violin and the piano.
Yeah.
And I love the moment where it switches, the piano leads first, and then the violin gets to lead, and then the piano leads again. It's just so beautiful.
Yeah. It's in probably my favorite key, A major.
Mm.
And he wrote the theme perfectly that it would fit a rondo, or not a rondo, a canon, like
Mhm.
you mentioned, because there's little pauses that allow the other person to follow along. I believe in the first statement of the theme, the piano starts, but then when it recaps later on, the violin starts.
Yes,
That's a little beautiful detail.
very beautiful. And to me, this last movement, I think of something very precious like glass. It's so beautiful, and you want to be so careful with it. Any sharp movement in the arm or anything will break the beautiful thing that you're crafting. And it's just like love. When things are going really well, you feel this immense sense of euphoria. And there's still, I wouldn't say it's caution, but it's a feeling that you don't want this feeling to end and you just want it to continue and you want to keep things going in this smooth, expressive way.
Yeah, I think this fourth movement, again, it is so effective because you really got the full picture of the previous movements. So it feels even more blissful and serene because you had experienced those previous movements.
You're totally right.
And if this movement was just presented by itself, it really wouldn't have the same effect, I think,
You're totally
because
right.
it is a beautiful theme, but it just somehow fits so well in the piece
Mhm.
as a whole.
You're right. I mean, it's actually such a huge emotional arc, this piece. Not to go back to Debussy, but Debussy also has a huge emotional arc. Like every time I play that piece, it's only 15 minutes, but I feel exhausted. I feel like I've been playing for an hour just because he's so volatile with his emotions. Franck, every movement is a new thing, so it does feel like a big moment. Actually, this is kind of a personal thing, but playing Franck Sonata, the third movement, that's the first and only time I've ever actually cried during a performance. I was at the Princess Astrid competition in Norway, And I was playing the third movement on my birthday, actually, my 18th birthday. And I just felt so moved during the third movement. And even though I was in a competition setting, and it's not really a good thing to have tears start to form when you're performing because it can affect your ability to, if you feel like, I personally always think it's a good thing to feel while you express, because in a way we're actors, and if an actor doesn't believe the role that they're trying to portray, it doesn't come across very well or very convincingly, I
Yes.
think.
Yeah. That is such a precious and personal, thoughtful story that you shared. And I can't remember a time where I actually was in tears when I was performing, but there were certainly times when I was listening that I was moved to tears. And yeah, that really is amazing that you had that story.
Oh, thanks, Stephen. And it wasn't because I played so beautifully or anything like that. I just, the music was just so moving. And I think feeling that emotional arc, at least for me, having a narrative, I think the role of narrative can be very impactful. When I was younger, my teachers were always like, you should come up with a story. And so I would think of all these funny little stories to go along with pieces. But some pieces defy narratives. And I think that's important. You can try to make a narrative for anything that you want, but all art is different. And for example, I like films a lot. Some films or some paintings and some music has a clear narrative arc. There's a story going on, and that's the driving force behind it. There are other art pieces that capture a specific feeling, films that capture feelings, and it's not so much about the story, but about how they make you feel. So I think that with pieces, I think it'd be cool if we move on to Bach, because I feel that Bach is one of those composers that doesn't always have a strong narrative, and his music can come across in different ways. And I'm wondering how you interpret Bach, specifically maybe solo Bach, but feel free to talk about all different types of Bach.
Yeah. So I think we learned in music history class that a lot of Bach's music was written for the church. So that plays a big part into his music. I think harmony is a big driving force and motif. It is, yeah, not so much necessarily an overarching narrative driven type of piece, although in some of his concertos, you do see a first theme, a second theme sometimes. But in a lot of his solo works, it's often like a prelude that goes through a bunch of different harmonies, and then a fugue that is extremely motivic. And he was known for the fugue. He wrote 3-part, 4-part, sometimes even 5-part fugues.
Wow.
So he really was a huge innovator in music. And as violinists, we associate Bach kind of like the Bible a little bit. We treat it like the foundation of so much of music. And it really is, we practice it religiously because it's so fundamental to our technique and also to our interpretation, because there's a purity to Bach that you don't find in any other composer. And there's a sense of sincerity in that purity, I think, because even with Mozart, it is quite pure, but there's a little bit of charm and elegance in there that spices things up a little bit, I
Some
think.
goofiness too.
Yeah. Yeah, but with Bach, it feels so sincere and heartfelt, everything. And a lot of times it's like quite simple too. It's not, something crazy, but the whole Baroque style is just embracing this purity of performance. And we have to talk about Baroque practice a little bit if we're going to talk about Bach. In terms of the actual differences in technical approach to playing Bach, the vibrato is much less wide and much less prevalent, because when you vibrate too much, it creates too much passion and intensity for a Baroque period piece. It kind of distorts a little bit that purity. And so a lot of it is found through the bow speed and shaping the phrases with the bow, which you do in romantic works too, but a lot of it is more sustaining and intensity of sound rather than the pure shaping. But in Baroque playing, because there's less intensity, you have to find it through the shape more. And also, just with Bach being related to church, there's always a sort of resonance that you get in Bach. And that's really good for violin playing, because we often think of violin playing as very singing and very intense. And it certainly can do that too. That is a very strong part about playing the violin. But we forget that the violin is actually very resonant too. My former teacher, Ty Murray, talked about resonance a lot with me. And I really changed my understanding of violin playing quite a bit after I studied with her, because I came from the Ivan Galamian school, and his schooling, I think, is really good for fundamental technique. But it's a little bit more suited for romantic big concertos where you just need intensity and loudness and pressure of sound. But it's a little bit less nuanced when it comes to this Baroque phrasing.
You're so right.
And when I studied with Ty, I just learned how beautifully you can craft a phrase in something like Bach, which you can apply to your romantic works as well. That's the beauty of it. That is something that is rooted in Bach in all his pieces, and that I really think is super important when you're trying to interpret Bach.
I totally agree. Those are some really, really good points. I definitely agree with the spiritual nature of Bach. And actually, I felt like I had a bit of a breakthrough last year when I was playing Bach because, well, one of my friends is really into meditation. He talked to me about meditation, and I started doing some meditation. And then when I started playing Bach, something clicked, and I was like, wow, these slow movements are really like meditations. I feel like in a slow movement, often one thought drifts into another, and then you come back to the same thought, and then you drift to another thing. And it just feels like this natural flow of consciousness. And often I think the religious theme, I think Bach probably came from a feeling that his music was expressing certain religious themes with God and all this type of stuff. For me, I just view it as a meditation about, it can be really about anything, but I think Bach's music is really very introspective and it's not very flashy. A lot of Bach is not very flashy. And I think that's one of the reasons why I think it's so pure, because as music is not primarily an external experience, rather an internal one. Bach is so true to that, and everything important happens within you as you're playing Bach. And I think the fugues for me, especially when there's a theme and then it gets repeated over and over, that kind of feels to me when I'm thinking about things and thoughts keep popping up and different thoughts, here and there. Yeah.
Yeah, the fugue kind of reminds me of someone who's all over the place a little bit, and I gotta do this, and then I gotta work on that, and then, oh, this person's calling me, and whatever. It's always constantly popping up.
Yeah, this sounds really unhealthy, but when I was young, because I was always worried that my mom would tell me to practice and things like that, when I was practicing, sometimes I would hear my mom or my teacher in my head saying certain things. And that's kind of how I feel with the fugue. It's like you start alone, and then you have these different interrupting voices here and there. And that is a really interesting thing for me. Of course, I don't have these voices popping up in my head anymore, but yeah.
Yeah, the Bach fugue, he really took it to an extreme, because still to this day, no one can replicate his fugues because he wrote so many of them. And it's kind of like Strad or something. It was a legend, and then it's really hard to replicate, even if you try as hard as you can. It just goes to show how he was a real craftsman in his works, too.
You're so right. One thing I just wanted to mention is one of my earliest teachers, Hessen Lee, who we talked about a little bit last episode. When I first started learning Bach, I was like, this is really boring. I was like 12, and she asked me to memorize one movement, and it took me forever because I was just like, I don't understand it. It just goes to random places, and how am I supposed to memorize this when you keep changing the rhythm everywhere? Like, because of the embellishments and things like that. And she told me, of all the composers that have ever written music, Bach is probably the most beautiful music ever written for solo violin. And that is true. I mean, there's Yazai, and there are some other composers, of course, that have written some really amazing work. But really, as far as solo violin works go, Bach is the epitome of beauty with solo violin. Oh, and one thing that I was going to say is I think that the reason that the fugue is difficult for me to sometimes connect to is because I think it's less connected to a certain emotion, or I feel that I connect to emotionally charged music very well. I think that the fugue is almost purely cognitive. I could be mistaken because I don't know that much about fugues, but I think that it's really like musical architecture. He masterfully crafts a compelling structure with his fugues, and he's able to layer things so intricately and figure out all these different modulations. And of course, Stephen, maybe you should talk about that since your theory is very strong.
Yeah, I agree. It is a little bit more cognitive, and I'm sure it was in his compositional process as well, because he had to take this fugue and think about how he'd modulate it and how he'd fit it. And I'm sure he kind of took little pieces and had to piece them together as he was writing it, because it is so complex. I feel that there are some musicians that really like that sort of thing. And it is really fun, and you can geek out about Bach Fugues, and you'll always learn something new because he wrote so many and they're so interesting. It is really a phenomenon because now when we study theory and we're forced to learn about Bach Fugues, we analyze exactly what he did. So there's the first statement and then the second statement, and then I forgot the specific theory term, and then there's variations, and then there's the theme stated backwards, something, there's a specific word for that. And it does show how architecturally amazing Bach is as a composer. But I do agree that it's kind of like a huge cathedral or a great piece of architecture. It's really stunning to look at, and you marvel at just the creation of it. But it's maybe a little bit less easy to relate to in some ways.
I totally agree. I think maybe I should think of a large, intricate structure when I play the fugues. One thing that stresses me out with fugues, especially in competition, is it's really easy to take a wrong turn. And then you end up in some random key and you're like, uh-oh, I've never played in this key before. And you're like, wait, have I? I'm not sure. And sometimes you just keep going no matter what, and then you end up at the end. You're like, woo, can't believe I made it.
Yeah, certainly. I remember this funny story where Yu Qin Cheng, the Taiwanese violinist, he said he was playing the Bach C major fugue, which is the longest fugue Bach wrote. It's about 10 minutes for solo violin. And he played through it and got lost. Then he went back and then had to play through it again. Then he got
No.
lost again. And then he
Oh,
had to go through it and go till the end. He finally didn't take the wrong turn and got to the end, but he was on stage for like 20 minutes or more
oh
than that.
man. See, I would just play the last note at that point. You know, our friend Paolo, he actually told me this funny story where one time he was performing a movement of Bach, the yada 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 yada. Sorry for singing again. And he said he accidentally played the first line and then he skipped to the last line. Then he just ended and bowed. And like, yeah, that's hilarious. I mean, that's something that's super relatable because I've definitely been there. I remember when I was playing my Bach fugue for one of the first times when I was doing this YCA audition. I just got to like the second page, which isn't really that far into the fugue, and I just got stuck and I just had to stop and say, sorry, I don't know where I am. And even to this day, when I get to that place, I'm always like, oh man, like I feel the stress. And I remember actually a very famous cellist, maybe it was Stephen Isserlis, who did a complete Bach cycle in Carnegie Hall. He said that that was both the pinnacle of his career and something that he'd never want to do again because it's just so easy to have I think maybe all Bach should just be played with music. Then you can just relax. But then at the same time, it would change the way. I think slow movements are fine, but man, the fugues really get me. But, you know, maybe it's because I don't understand the structure well enough too. I think for people who really break down the structure, everything is very logical that Bach does actually. And for me not being able to follow those trails of logic because my theory isn't so strong, I think that really affects my ability to play a fugue with effectiveness.
Yeah, I think what's amazing about Bach is you talked about the slow movement, the Largo movement, third movement from his third solo violin sonata. What's amazing about Bach is some violinists play it in a really romantic way sometimes. And while it might not be super stylistically appropriate, what that says about Bach is he has that singing quality to his music, but he also has harmonic structure that few composers can even rival. Because after Bach, you're kind of like, oh, I guess I just gotta go atonal. So Bach really, his music encompasses everything, truly.
That's true. Did you want to talk a little bit about Bach E major? Since that one's so bright, I know you've been playing that one recently.
Yeah. So he wrote 3 sonatas and 3 partitas, and his partitas are basically dance movements. And I think the E major is super fun because it's very bright and virtuosic. The first movement, the preludio, is super fast, and that was the first Bach movement I think I ever learned. And it's so virtuosic. Again, Bach, he has virtuosity too,
That's
which
true.
is so cool. The second movement, the Lore, is a beautiful singing movement, but it has a slow dance feel to it. And
That one's hard. That
it
one's
is
really hard.
hard to play in tune. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then the famous Gavotte in Rondo piece, a theme that comes back throughout, and just the variations are so beautifully crafted.
Mhm.
I love when it goes to the softer, more introspective variation in the middle.
Mm.
That's so beautiful. And then he has 2 minuets that are very short, but Bach was known for the minuet, his famous minuet in G. There's something very calming and relaxing about it. And then we get the Bourrée, which is a quick dance and a little pep in your step, maybe, the way it starts. And then it ends with the wonderful Gigue, which is just a nice ending, kind of similar to the Preludio, probably the most similar movement to the first movement. Again, I think there's just so much opportunity to phrase and really find resonance in this piece. And the E major is just so ringing on the violin.
It is.
I know the D minor partita is the most famous, and D rings well too, but do you notice when you play certain keys, the violin just responds a little better?
Yeah. E is so bright, and there's a happiness to that. The rondo is so great. I really love rondo forms in general. If it's a good theme, if it's a bad theme that you keep coming back to, that I don't like it. But I think it's so charming. You have a great little theme, and then you have something different, and then you have a great little theme, and then you have something different. It feels really cool. And then whenever you come back to the theme, then you can think about what you want to do differently, or if you want to do it all exactly the same. Probably not. But one thing that I love about Bach E major is I feel like that whole part with the crossing of the strings, the first time I encountered that, I was so shocked. I was like, I can't believe this is Bach, because it just feels like such a massive, of course, I don't know if this was an innovation at the time, but it just seems so crazy technically. Like, wow, you start on the A string, then you go to E string, you go back to A string, then you go to D string, and you get this cool effect here. And it's actually really hard.
It is very
It's really hard, yeah. It feels almost virtuosic in a way. It sounds really cool. And I just think it was cool that Bach knew the instrument so well, he was able to think of something like that.
Yeah, we can't even begin to understand and describe Bach's genius for writing these sonatas. And it really is the golden standard for solo violin literature. And that section with the string crossing kind of reminds me of his organ works. An organ being this huge enveloping sound and this constant resonance in a big room, just this overwhelming feeling. And he was able to create that on the violin, which is just a testament to how amazing of a composer he was. And that passage is kind of similar to the first cadenza in the Sibelius concerto. So it just shows that Bach was well past his time.
That's true. One final thing about Bach before we move on is I just wanted to mention the Andante in Sonata No. 2, which is a beautiful movement. For me, I think of that as a meditation as well. One day I was at the beach and I was there just kind of enjoying the waves rolling in and rolling out. And of course, some waves are larger than others and some waves are smaller than others. You just hear the sound of the waves coming in, and it's constant. And it never stops, and you always know that another wave is about to come. And that's how that movement feels to me, with the constant seas that go on in the background. It feels like waves just rolling in, and some take a little bit longer on the beach before they roll back, and some go pretty quickly. That just gave me such a peaceful feeling thinking about that. It's been an unshakable thought in my, every time I hear it now, I just feel like I'm transported to the beach. And But of course, with this movement, I don't view it as a sunny day on the beach. It's usually, I think the day that I was there was a bit dreary, but I felt a profound sense of peace thinking about that movement and listening to the waves.
That's such a great analogy. And that movement is probably the most meditative movement, at least in the solo Bach repertoire, because of the constant pulsings of the Cs and the bass notes. And it is such a simple melody, but it just goes straight into your heart.
It really
Feels
does. It's amazing that some composers are able to say so much with so little. And one final thought that I have about Bach is one time I was watching somebody record some solo Bach or perform. And at CIM, there's this mixing hall where there's a glass in the back of the hall. And I was just watching these trees sway in the breeze. And the wind just rustled through the leaves and they slowly, and it just felt like Bach just suited that feeling so well. And sometimes I think that when we play music, we always look for something so profound. It has to be deep. It's got to be something that expresses, the meaning of life. But sometimes I think music can be as simple as capturing one moment of beauty, such as the wind just rustling through the trees and the leaves shaking as the wind blows it one way or another. And just being able to express that feeling that you get watching something like that is profound in itself.
Yeah, I thought of Mahler when you said that because when you talk about nature and music, music really can profoundly describe and show in sound form nature because nature is so expansive. And of course, music expresses human emotion, human thoughts, but it also expresses the beauty and sounds of nature. And how that connects to Mahler is he was obsessed with nature. And his symphonies, there's bird calls and like sounds of cows or some things like that. And it's literal direct quotes of nature.
Wow.
I'm sure all these composers were directly influenced by their surroundings. The other composer that I thought of directly was Sibelius. Being from Finland, apparently it's very cold there, and the mountain landscapes are so vast. And so in his symphonies and his violin concerto, you feel this sense of scope. All of his music, it's commonly in 6/4. That's one thing, kind of a vaster feeling than 6/8. It really is expressing this picturesque landscape. If you think of the opening of Sibelius's Second Symphony, there really is no opening like that. It just bum, 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 bing, bum, bing, bum. It's just like the opening to a great film or just showing the beautiful grass and the green trees and the beautiful spring air, stuff like that. I think music is such a direct reflection of nature.
I think you're totally right. And maybe since we're talking about composers influenced by nature, let's move on to Beethoven. And I was thinking that it might be fun to talk about Beethoven's Violin Sonata 4 versus 5. Since 4 is so stormy, then right after that you have maybe one of the most pleasant violin sonatas that Beethoven ever wrote.
Yeah, I've had more experience with 5, his spring sonata, but yeah, his fourth sonata is extremely intense and very Beethovenian, as I like to say. And his fifth sonata, titled Spring, has this sense of that spring air that I was talking about, and the trees blooming again and the flowers. And the fifth sonata has definitely more a sense of nature to it. The second movement is so slow and beautiful and serene, and the opening piano 16th notes accompaniment, and then the violin comes in just with this most beautiful and heartwarming, campfire. You're just sitting there having conversation with people, and it's just embracing that dark but beautiful night. I think of that a lot. And then the third movement is so quick and chirpy, and
Yeah.
you could think of some birds or something like that.
That's what
And
I
then
think.
the fourth movement of the Spring Sonata, there's a pleasantness and a sweetness to it. That's what really drew me to that movement. Is a certain sweetness to it that just reminds you of like a new season.
Yeah, you're totally right.
And then the fourth sonata is just so intense from the beginning. It just shocks you right away. And he has that in his fifth sonata, but it's less intense in that way. And there's more like bigger phrases. The fourth sonata has these very carefully crafted phrases, and it feels more like human emotion. And while we're on the topic of Beethoven, I might as well talk about what made Beethoven unique. I think one of the main things was his emphasis on motives. And that's very apparent in his fourth sonata, the second movement, because it's basically a two-note motive.
Yeah,
right?
you're right.
And so I think the motives are super important and bringing those out. And he's really obsessive about those too. So maybe you could relate more to like speech. That second movement of the fourth sonata reminds me a little bit more of like someone talking and taking slow steps towards something. It maybe doesn't remind me of nature as much. And the last movement is extremely stormy.
Yeah, I feel that Beethoven's fourth violin sonata is filled with anxiety. The first movement and the third movement feel like they're both on edge.
Yes.
And then the second movement in the middle, I remember playing this in the summertime, and I remember looking out of the window and just imagining kids playing. At first, I didn't like this movement at all. I was like, what? This movement, a second movement. I was expecting like a beautiful second movement.
Yes.
And then this one is just da-dum, 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 boom, boom. It's so like, what? That's a nothing, you know, like, but now I really love that movement. And I imagine these children outside playing hide and seek. And I thought that just made the movement feel alive to me. It felt youthful and fresh and fun.
Yeah, later on in that movement, it's quite witty and very playful.
Very playful.
Yeah, thank you for that analogy. 'Cause
oh, no problem.
when I perform it, I think I'm going to think about that because it is just very charming and playful. And you don't really know where Beethoven's going to go in that movement.
Yeah, it's so cool. I view that opening, the da-dum, you're like looking around a corner, checking potential hiding places. Yod, is he there? Da-dum, bum, bum. I guess not. Da-dum. I think he's over here. Da-dum, da-dum, bum, bum. It's really cool. And somebody's like teasing you, like, oh, you can't find me. And you hear their voice, but you don't know where they are. I really like that feeling. Yeah, and then the Spring Sonata is just so, I really struggle with that sonata because I think the theme is so beautiful and it's hard to do it justice. A lot of people play Spring Sonata, and I think that it's one of those pieces that gets played so often that people stop playing it. And now it's kind of nice to hear it again because I feel like I don't hear Spring Sonata that much anymore. But that opening is so difficult, at least for me, to get the sound that I want because you're right, it is like a breath of fresh spring air right at the beginning. Whoever named that sonata did an excellent job. They really got the right, and I think that's interesting actually that 4 and 5 are the way they are because Beethoven Symphony 5 is also quite stormy, and then the Pastoral Symphony is right after that, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, that was also F major, the pastoral. And F major has this sense of pastoral quality, this landscape quality that is present in the Spring Sonata. What's so cool about the Spring Sonata is it's often like a beginner's violin sonata. It's the first sonata I ever played with piano.
Wow.
And because it's kind of simple, but again, he's able to draw so much beauty out of simple, basic accompaniment. And Beethoven is famously the bridge between classical period to romantic. And we probably don't have enough time to talk about all of Beethoven in this episode, but he really was one of the most experimental composers ever.
That's true. Well, I really want to go more into detail about Beethoven, but you're totally right. We'll save it for a future episode that we'll do just about Beethoven, because I think that Beethoven is really one of the most incredible, I mean, this is not a controversial statement, he's one of the most incredible musicians and composers to have ever lived. There are a lot of composers who compose great music, and you see how they evolved through time. But Beethoven evolved in ways that are unimaginable. He went from composing like Haydn to who knows what. At the end, his music basically sounds like contemporary music. It's insane where he subverted expectations, then he subverted his subversions. There's no other composer I can think of that has done so much for the classical music world. He revolutionized sound.
Yeah, we have to talk about Beethoven in a different context because of just what he did. And so I think it's deserving of its own episode.
Yeah, we'll do that in the future. So look forward to that, I guess. All right, well, let's move on to Mozart briefly, because I think that Mozart is character driven, very operatic composer, obviously, a goofy guy.
Yeah. Well, Mozart deserves his own episode too. There's a certain charm and elegance in Mozart, and his music is always so carefully and beautifully crafted, like Bach. But whereas Bach has this more pure quality, Mozart has this sort of smile, charm, and this sweetness that I feel Bach has sometimes, but it's not as apparent. You hear a piece of Mozart, you know it's Mozart.
Mm-hmm.
It's so distinct. And he was one of the most craziest prodigies ever musically. He was writing symphonies when he was like in his teens, probably even before that.
Crazy.
Yeah.
I mean, all his violin concertos were written very early when he was 16 to, I forget, but I think he was quite young.
Before he was 18, yeah.
Wow.
He wrote it in
all 5?
Yeah.
That's crazy to me because that's standard repertoire. And he wrote it before he even reached adulthood.
Yeah.
So that's really amazing.
Yeah, he wrote tons of string quartets, tons of violin sonatas, actually, like 20 of them, tons of symphonies, and tons of opera.
Yeah.
And we're not classically trained opera singers, obviously, but Mozart's huge in the opera world. What's funny about Mozart and opera is people sing it in a very intense, romantic way.
Yeah.
But then sometimes our teachers tell us not to do that in Mozart.
It's interesting because people say, think of opera, but then if you replicate opera exactly, then people, that's too much. You know what I think about Mozart oftentimes is Mozart is interesting to me because Mozart was a goofy guy and he always was around the aristocrats and he was a part of this aristocratic society. And he wore the same clothes probably, he wore the wigs and all that, but really inside he didn't have a stick up his butt like a lot of people did there, and he was really this charming, well, maybe not charming, maybe it was a lot to deal with, but really he wanted to joke around and do his little thing. So I feel that his music, it has this poise to it to please the aristocrats, but he inserts himself in there and all these little funny things that go on. His music is full of little moments of just joy. I saw this one quote that I really enjoyed, and it was obviously a religious quote, but it said, God gave us Bach, for whatever reason, and then God gave us Beethoven for whatever reason, I don't remember. But they said Mozart is God's laughter. I should have just not said the first 2 things, but because I don't remember. But I always thought that was funny because, yeah, Mozart really is full of joy and laughter, and it's very difficult. I just read for the first time Mozart's Sonata K454 in B flat, which is a really great piece. And when I got to the last movement, which is also in rondo form, I just really like rondo form. He just goes into so many, he thinks of all these great ideas, and it was just, I couldn't help but smile when I was playing it because it's just like, wow, this is so funny, like I can't believe that he thought of this, and it's something that kind of doesn't really belong, and it's just, I didn't expect the music to go there, and I just felt charmed.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about this video of Leonidas Kavakos talking about how Mozart was a genius, and he was saying how Mozart's music at his time was like the pop music of today. Everyone knew it. And it was like everyone loved it as much as we love popular music today. So that gives some insight to how amazing he was. I just want to maybe mention one experience of when I played the Mozart Sinfonia Concertante for violin and viola. That is in one of my favorite keys, E flat major, a very heroic key. But the second movement of that piece is in C minor. And Mozart doesn't often write keys in minor. And that second movement is one of the most tragic movements because, again, he doesn't write often in minor. And he has a lyrical quality to his music in his slow movements that is just so amazing. Apparently, he wrote it after his mother had passed away. And there's just something so deeply personal and tragic about it that I feel it's similar to someone like Schubert. The melodies itself just hit you in a different way. And I just really loved and connected so much with that piece. I mean, it's one of the greatest works we have
Yeah.
in the literature. And I just love the viola part more than the violin part, even
Oh,
of
wow.
that piece, actually.
Well, yeah, I think Mozart is a genius. One thing that I wanted to say just briefly with interpreting Mozart, for so many years I struggled with Mozart, and I finally last year felt I also had a breakthrough, and I felt like I started understanding how to play Mozart, or at least how to enjoy playing Mozart while I was playing it, because for so many years it was a source of high stress for me. When I played Mozart, I felt like, oh man, everything's got to be pristine, and every note has to have a beginning, and it's got to phrase off like this, and these articulations need to be exactly the same, and all this kind of stuff was super stressful. And of course, that's why in the past episodes we talked about how technical proficiency is necessary in order to achieve musicality, because while I was worried about all these technical things, I couldn't really enjoy the music. So finally, I started enjoying the music so much more, and part of it was being able to not take Mozart so seriously. Just thinking of Mozart as a goofy guy really helped, because I think that Mozart was not so serious. And because we're trying to do a good job and we're trying to, historical performance practice, etc., a lot of the times there are so many rules set in place. And of course, all these rules are correct, generally speaking. It's not a bad thing to do those. But once those are internalized, I think that it's difficult to let go of all the tension that's kind of built up by keeping all these things in check, and to really feel free. And once you achieve that freedom of expression, I think Mozart becomes a lot more enjoyable to play.
I think so. I think Mozart is one of the hardest composers to play and perform because it is kind of simple. We often learn his concerto as one of our first concertos. But when you get more advanced, it gets even harder because even though technically it seems not so hard, it just needs to be so carefully crafted. And so I totally understand the difficulty there. But we see in his operas that it is super goofy.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm thinking of the third concerto, the little bouncing second theme.
Mm,
Something like that's just so playful.
yeah.
And it's like, it's not something that you gotta, go there and be like,
And it often feels like you do have to do that. But you're
yeah,
totally right. Yeah, Mozart is really charming. And just to tie one parallel in, since I love film so much, I think Mozart reminds me of Wes Anderson. Wes Anderson is a filmmaker who's known for his whimsical nature. I view him as a very optimistic nihilist, because his films have a lot of detail and they're overly complicated. But at the end of the day, it just gives you a good feeling. And nothing that happened really matters, but you had a really good time watching the film. And it's the same thing with Mozart, not saying that nothing really matters, but there are a lot of details and a lot of things and when Wes Anderson crafts his films, everything is meticulous. He takes so much care with the details of his films, and he doesn't need to do this, but he often gives way too many details for anybody to possibly remember. A character comes out and there's this whole long monologue about all these different things that they did and what their
yeah.
background is, and boom, 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 and you're like, oh my god, there's so much information. It doesn't really matter, but it adds to the experience of the film. It makes it more enjoyable. And I think that's the same with Mozart. Mozart has a lot of details and there's a lot of things to pay attention to. But at the end of the day, without that pleasant feeling, it's really hard to get that feeling correct, though, because Wes Anderson, he's had a lot of films, and most of them are tremendous successes, I think. But there are a couple of films where I feel like it just falls flat. And to me, that was illuminating. And also, I appreciated all the films where things went right, because it's so easy for things to go wrong and you can't even put a finger on it. It's hard to even identify what went wrong. But I think Mozart is almost like a stack of cards or a card tower. You stack everything up perfectly. And if one thing's out of place, it's easy for things to crumble. So everything needs to be really pristine, but it's also important to have fun doing it.
Yeah, it's very clear if you're not really embracing the character of Mozart when you play Mozart. It can be so bland. And it's very hard because it is so elegant. And whereas romantic composers, you can just dig in and give more passion. Even Beethoven, in a way,
Hmm.
because of his angry, kind of more serious side to him,
Hmm.
his personality, you can kind of dig in. That's a little bit easier for certain players to embrace, especially
Hmm.
when you're nervous. But when you're nervous, because Mozart's so light and elegant, it's hard to really bring that character out.
It's true. Okay, we should move on. But before, I just have one really funny short story.
Yeah.
I was at my last competition and I was talking to a member of the jury, and she told me, I thought your Mozart was very strong. And I said, well, thank you. And she said, no, 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 no. I meant it was too strong. So yeah, still something I'm working on. But yeah, that is so hard to get the right feeling, especially under pressure. It's hard.
And also, Mozart is one of the most controversial pieces in a competition, too, because despite it having a very distinct style, a lot of jury members have many different thoughts about how it should be. Some jury member once told me to not use vibrato in Mozart.
Wow.
And he was like, they didn't use vibrato at that time, so you shouldn't use it. And then you hear these singers using constant vibrato.
Too much vibrato sometimes
Yeah,
too.
too
Yeah.
much. So it's a really hard balance, but I understand where that jury member was coming from and
Hmm.
that Mozart should never be kind of rough.
Yeah.
Beethoven has that sforzando rough feeling,
Hmm.
and all these romantic composers have that side to them, but
Hmm.
Mozart never. It's just elegant always. But there's just so much taste and nuance, and they heard you're playing one time and they're judging based off their preconceptions and idea of playing. And
Hmm.
so
It was
I,
definitely
yeah,
a valid comment. I mean, it's something that's difficult. I mean, I wouldn't want to play Mozart too aggressively either, but it's difficult in the moment sometimes. I notice under pressure, I tend to clench, and that doesn't help for Mozart at all. So, yeah.
yeah. If you're playing in a competition, there's a reason why they require Mozart concerto in like the second to last round. But if you had the choice to play any concerto, you should not pick Mozart. I would recommend.
Unless you're supremely gifted at Mozart, I guess.
Unless if you are supremely gifted, but
But
I,
you really have to tickle the judges. I mean, you have to charm them so much that they have no choice to just.
it really
Yeah.
is one of the hardest things to pull off in a competition because the judges are so particular about Mozart. And I think they should be a little bit more understanding because it is so hard to pull off that feeling. But in a competition, even if you try really hard, Mozart can just sometimes not come off as well.
That's true. Well, I just wanted to bring up Bartok a little bit because I remember that you, Stephen, are very interested in languages, and I think Bartok has a unique musical language. Maybe you'd like to share about how you view it.
Yeah, so I was lucky to play quite a bit of Bartók. I played his violin concerto, his solo sonata, and I recently played his first violin piano sonata.
Wow.
And the main thing I drew was from the Hungarian language. Apparently, there's a lot of emphasis on the first syllable of words. And so, for example, the second concerto, da da dee da dee da dee dee da dee da dee da dee da dee ba dee da.
Mm.
So there's that understanding. And every teacher says that about Bartok, so I'm not covering any new ground there. The other thing that teachers often say is it's very folky, and it is true. He used lots of fourths and fifths. There's a certain roughness to Bartok, actually. He has his own musical language, too,
Mm.
and it probably has to do with his personality, too. I think that he is a fantastic composer. He's often counted as like the fourth B from Bach, Beethoven, Brahms, and then Bartok. I think that his first violin sonata is actually really amazing. The third movement in particular, it's super fast, and the piano part is like you're racing on a horse or something. He's just very evocative with his music, and
Mm.
I think it relates a lot to paintings as well. His slow movements are often very serene and peaceful in all those pieces I mentioned too.
Mm.
And he's also a master of structure with his six-string quartets. He really wrote some of the greatest string quartets because it's so beautifully crafted. Actually, every part is equally important. most string quartets, the first violin gets like the main melody most of the time.
Mhm.
So he was really, really innovative. I think the main thing is there's a certain directness and pure raw emotion and seriousness that comes in his music, and a little bit of like a gypsy quality. And then I recently played Enescu Sonata, the third sonata, and that one
Nice.
is one of the craziest pieces ever
I
written.
like that one.
But that one is also extremely gypsy.
That's super cool. Do you feel like language influences your interpretation of music in general? Because Steven actually, for I think most people probably don't know this, but you took Japanese, Korean, you know, Chinese and English and any
Yeah.
other languages?
No, that's it. And
Because that's a lot of languages.
yeah, I'm not fluent in all those languages, but I think languages have a huge impact on music because music really is a language, and a composer's native language influences how they write the music. And so the articulations in, for example, French music are often a little bit different compared to German music. German usually feels a little bit more like solid, and then
Mhm.
French is a little bit like
Mm.
more up in the air.
It phrases off nicely. And yeah, it's so interesting because when I was in Italy, I just loved listening to people talk because it felt so musical. The language just phrases exactly how you would phrase in music. I was like, wow, it's just so beautiful to listen to.
Yeah, and I don't really know Hungarian super well, but yeah, I think that the languages we speak also influence how we interpret because we understand music kind of through our language too, our
Hmm.
native language. So,
That's true.
and Chinese music isn't super common in the classical realm, but there's usually a huge emphasis on like pentatonic stuff. And I
Right.
think that it feels kind of folky in that way, and it's just immediately relatable to a lot of Chinese people. And so I think there's definitely a certain connection there as well.
Well, that's really cool.
With that, maybe we'll jump to our practice tip for the week and
All right.
also recording recommendation of the week. I'll go first with just a quick practice tip for the
Okay.
week. This is just off the top of my head, but this is kind of basic, but I've been noticing in my students, I've been having to teach it a lot. And I think it's really helpful for me. But basically, the importance of grouping things and dividing things into small portions. The famous term is divide and conquer. But
Mm,
basically, whenever you have a fast passage, you just want to group notes. And I learned this from Nathan Cole mainly,
mm,
but
that's cool.
you treat groups of notes as one note. And so I've been really stressing this in my teaching because students often, and not for bad reason, they learn one note at a time.
Mm,
And at a certain point, like how you learn a language, you have to start saying words and not one syllable at a time.
right.
And so practicing a group of notes and treating it as one note will eventually increase your fluency. And so I've been really stressing that, just breaking passages down and playing the group of note itself very quickly, but then having a lot of time in between to prepare for the next group. And
Mm,
so slow practicing, but you're actually still practicing fast because the group itself is fast, but your mind is actually able to adjust and change and fix the things you actually want to fix.
I like
I
that.
think that's very important. Now, I think this is only kind of the building block structure of learning a passage that's difficult. Eventually, perfecting a passage and incorporating it into a musical context, I think that takes a lot more time and effort. Actually, I think it's even harder than just building a passage up to put it into musical context. But that's just something that I thought of.
Yeah, well, that's definitely super helpful. My recording recommendation of the week is going to be going along with my love for rondos. I'm going to recommend Tibor Varga's recording of Mozart's Rondo in C major. A
Yes.
real masterclass on bow speed. He uses so much bow. I don't know how it's possible, but I notice that he keeps his bow quite loose and it gives his sound this very ringing quality. I notice when I loosen my bow a little bit, I don't know if it's just because at that time, maybe in Mozart's time, bows were of lower tension. So using a lot of bow when you have your bow quite loose actually draws out more overtones, I feel. And you're able to move your bow quite fast without it feeling like you are moving your bow quite fast. And Tibor Varga, yeah, he really uses a crap ton of bow, but it's very musical and it's a little bit faster than what some people prefer for the Mozart Rondo. But I enjoy it because I personally like a little bit faster tempos because when it's really slow, it's beautiful, but it doesn't feel so dance-like to me. I like it with a little bit of speed on it.
Yeah, I know that recording too, and I didn't notice the bow tension thing, but I did notice you had your bow a little bit looser today. But yeah, bow tension, I think there's a lot of variance. It depends on the violin, depends on the bow, and the type of sound. If you're playing orchestra or chamber, you don't need as projecting of a sound. You want more colors. I think lighter tension bow, less tension is good for drawing out more colors and more lush sound, but you need a certain amount of tension if you want raw power.
Yeah.
And so it's a hard balance, and it depends on the bow too, because for example, the bow I play, it's great when it's low tension. I can really draw a lot of colors, but I really struggle to play loud when it's not tight enough because the stick is quite narrow. So
Mhm.
basically, I usually have it more tense,
Yeah, I noticed
more
that.
tight, sorry.
Yeah. All
Yeah.
right. Well, with that, that's the episode. Thank you so much for joining us, and we hope to see you next time. Bye.
Bye.